Robert sat at his large wooden desk. The room was quiet. It smelled like old paper and oil paint. Robert was an art restorer. He spent his days fixing old paintings. He used very small brushes and a magnifying glass. He loved his work because he liked to see the small details that other people missed. He was working on a landscape from the 19th century. The green trees on the canvas were starting to look bright again. Suddenly, he heard a soft noise at the door. It was the postman. A letter slid under the door and landed on the wooden floor. Robert stood up and stretched his back. He walked to the door and picked up the letter. It was not a normal bill or a magazine. The envelope was heavy and bright gold. His name, Robert Miller, was written in beautiful black ink on the front. He went back to his desk and opened the envelope carefully. Inside, there was a thick card. It was an invitation to the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery requests the pleasure of your company. Robert read aloud. A private viewing of the masterpiece, Sunlight. Robert knew this painting. It was a very famous work of art. It was worth millions of dollars. The owner of the gallery was a woman named Clara. Robert worked for her many years ago. She was a serious woman with a sharp mind. He had not seen her in a long time. The party was tonight at 8 o'clock. The dress code was formal. Robert looked at his clothes. He was wearing an old shirt with blue paint stains on the sleeves. He looked at his hands. They were covered in dust and oil. I cannot go like this, he said to himself. He looked at the gold invitation again. At the bottom, there was a small note written by hand. It said, Robert, please come. I need your eyes tonight. Clara. Robert felt a strange feeling in his stomach. Why did Clara need his eyes? He was a restorer, not a buyer. Usually, people invited him when a painting was broken or dirty. But Sunlight was in perfect condition. It was the pride of the city. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was already 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He had 3 hours to prepare. He cleaned his brushes and put them away in a wooden box. He covered the landscape painting with a white cloth. He went to his bedroom and opened his closet. He found his best black suit. It was clean and neat. He found a white shirt and a silk tie. He wanted to look professional. Robert looked out the window. The sun was going down, and the sky was turning a dark purple color. He felt a mix of excitement and worry. He did not know why, but he felt that this was not a normal party. Something was waiting for him at the Grand Gallery. Robert stepped out of the taxi. The night air was cool and smelled like rain. He stood in front of the Grand Gallery. It was a beautiful stone building with large windows. 2 white marble lions stood at the entrance. They looked strong and silent. A long red carpet lay on the ground. It went from the street all the way to the heavy glass doors. Many people walked slowly on the carpet. The women wore long, expensive dresses. The men wore dark suits and shiny shoes. Many photographers stood behind a metal fence. Their cameras made bright flashes of light. The air was filled with activity as they took hundreds of pictures. Robert felt a little nervous. He was a simple man who liked his quiet studio. He usually spent his time with old paintings, not famous people. This world of luxury and money was very different for him. He adjusted his black tie and began to walk toward the entrance. At the door, a tall man stood with his arms crossed. He had a small radio in his ear and a very serious face. This was Simon, the head of security. He looked at every person very carefully. His eyes moved from their faces to their hands. He wanted to make sure everyone was safe. Name, please? Simon asked. His voice was deep and low. Robert Miller. Robert replied. He felt the man's eyes on his suit. Simon looked at a list on a small tablet. He found the name and nodded. He opened the heavy door for Robert. "Welcome, Mr. Miller. Enjoy the evening." Inside, the gallery was magnificent. The ceilings were very high and painted with white clouds. Large gold lamps hung from the ceiling. They gave a warm, yellow light to the big room. The floor was made of black and white marble. It was so clean that Robert could see his own reflection in the stone. In the middle of the hall, people stood in small groups. They held thin glasses of cold wine. They talked in soft voices. The sound of their conversations was like a low hum. Robert looked at the walls. There were many beautiful paintings, but one wall was empty except for a large purple curtain. Then, he saw Clara. She was standing near a large stone sculpture. She wore a long red dress and a diamond necklace. She looked like a queen, but when she saw Robert, her face changed. She looked relieved and happy. She walked toward him quickly. Her high shoes made a sharp sound on the marble floor. "Robert, you came," she said. She took his hand. Her hand felt very cold and she was shaking a little bit. "Hello, Clara," Robert said. "The gallery looks very beautiful tonight. You did a great job." Clara looked around the room. She leaned closer to Robert so the other guests could not hear her. "Thank you, but I am not happy tonight. Robert, I am very worried." "Why are you worried?" Robert asked. He looked at her eyes. They were wide and full of fear. Clara did not answer him immediately. She looked at the guests. She looked at Simon the guard. Finally, she looked back at Robert. "I cannot talk here," she whispered. "For now, please walk around. Look at the guests. And most importantly, look at the painting." She pointed to the purple curtain at the end of the hall. "We will show the painting in 10 minutes. Please, stay close." The room became very quiet. The guests stopped talking and turned their heads. Waiters in white jackets moved silently through the crowd. They carried silver trays with small pieces of bread and expensive cheese. Robert took a small glass of water. He watched the people. There were no children here, only wealthy adults in expensive clothes. Everyone was waiting for the big moment. Clara walked to the front of the room. She stood on a small wooden platform next to the purple curtain. A bright light shone on her. She looked very professional, but Robert saw her fingers pulling at the fabric of her dress. She was still nervous. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara said. Her voice was clear and loud. "Thank you for coming to the Grand Gallery. Tonight is a very special night. For 10 years, the masterpiece Sunlight was in a private collection. No one could see it. But today, it is back." The guests started to hit their hands together to show they were happy. The sound filled the high room. Robert stood at the back. He wanted to see the painting, but he also wanted to see the people. He noticed a man with white hair and a very expensive watch. The man was looking at the curtain with hungry eyes. This was the look of a man who wanted to buy something beautiful. Clara reached for a golden rope. "I present to you Sunlight." She pulled the rope. The heavy purple curtain fell to the floor. Behind the curtain was a large painting in a very heavy golden frame. The frame was carved with shapes of leaves and flowers. It was so bright that it looked like it was made of solid gold. The painting was beautiful. It showed a large lake at sunrise. The sky was filled with colors of orange, pink, and yellow. The water looked real, like Robert could reach out and touch the cold waves. The light in the painting was so strong that it felt like the sun was truly inside the room. The guests moved closer. They made small sounds of surprise and delight. "It is perfect," a woman whispered. "Look at the colors." A man replied. Robert did not speak. He walked slowly toward the wall. He was an expert. He knew how old paint should look. He knew how the light should hit the surface of a canvas from the 18th century. He stayed 3 meters away and looked at the corners of the painting. The golden frame was indeed magnificent. It was thick and heavy, but as Robert looked at the bottom right corner of the painting, he felt a cold shiver. Something was not right. The way the yellow paint met the blue of the water looked too fresh. The lines were too sharp. He looked at Clara. She was watching him. She did not look at the painting. She only looked at Robert's face. She saw his eyes narrow. She knew that he saw the truth. Robert looked back at the masterpiece. To everyone else, it was a beautiful dream. To Robert, it looked like a very clever lie. Robert stood still. He wanted to look closer at the painting, but many people were in his way. The air in the room felt warm because there were so many guests. The smell of expensive perfume was very strong. Robert felt a presence next to him. A tall man moved into his space. The man had very white hair and a tanned face. He looked like he spent a lot of time on a boat under the sun. He wore a dark blue suit that looked very expensive. On his left wrist, he had a large gold watch. On his right hand, he wore a white silk glove. Robert thought this was very strange. Why wear only one glove? It is a beautiful thing, is it not? The man asked. His voice was smooth and confident. Robert turned to him. Yes, it is very bright. Robert said. He did not want to say too much yet. My name is Mr. White. The man said. He did not offer his hand to shake. He kept his gloved hand behind his back. I collect the best things in the world. I have many paintings in my house, but I do not have a masterpiece like this one. Are you planning to buy it? Robert asked. Mr. White smiled. His teeth were very white and straight. Money is not a problem for me. Mr. Miller, I know who you are. You are the man who fixes the past. You make old things look new again. Robert was surprised. You know my name. I make it my business to know everyone in this room. Mr. White replied. He looked back at the painting. The light on the water is perfect. It looks so fresh. Almost too fresh, don't you think? Robert felt his heart beat faster. Did Mr. White also see the problem? Or was he testing Robert? Robert looked at the white glove on the man's hand. He noticed a small, dark mark on the thumb of the glove. It was a very small stain, but Robert's eyes were trained to see small things. The artist was a master of light. Robert said carefully, freshness is part of his style. Mr. White laughed. Of course. But styles can be copied. A clever person can make a new thing look very old, or an old thing look very new. Mr. White moved a step closer to the painting. Simon, the security guard, watched him closely. Simon's hand moved to the radio in his ear. He did not like people getting too close to the gold frame. I want this painting. Robert. Mr. White whispered. I want it very much. Some people will do anything to own something this beautiful. They will even lie. Mr. White turned and walked away toward the drink table. He walked with a slight limp in his left leg. Robert watched him go. He looked at the painting again. Then he looked at Clara across the room. She was watching Mr. White too. Her face was pale, and she looked like she wanted to cry. Robert knew he had to talk to her alone. He had to tell her what he saw in the paint. The guests moved toward the long tables filled with food. They were hungry and loud. This was Robert's chance. He walked slowly toward the painting. He did not want to look suspicious. He kept his hands in his pockets. Simon, the guard, stood near the wall. Simon watched Robert, but he did not move. Robert stood in front of sunlight. He was now very close. He could smell the heavy gold frame. He could see the tiny lines on the canvas. To a normal person, the painting looked perfect. But Robert was not a normal person. He spent 20 years looking at old paint through a lens. He looked at the sky in the painting. The orange and yellow colors were beautiful. Then, he looked at the dark blue water at the bottom. In the 18th century, artists used a special kind of blue paint. That paint always had tiny cracks after 200 years. These cracks are called craquelures. They look like a very small spider web on the surface. Robert leaned forward. His nose was almost touching the canvas. He looked at the blue water. There were cracks, but they looked strange. He took a small magnifying glass from his pocket. It was a tool he always carried with him. He looked through the glass. His heart stopped. The cracks were not real. Someone had painted the cracks onto the canvas with a very thin black brush. It was a very clever trick. To a guest standing 2 meters away, it looked old. But under the magnifying glass, the truth was clear. The paint was new. Robert moved his glass to the corner of the painting. He saw something else. Near the edge of the gold frame, there was a tiny blue hair. It was not a hair from a person. It was a small fiber from a modern synthetic brush. Artists in the 18th century used brushes made from animal hair. They did not have synthetic fibers. "It is a fake," Robert whispered to himself. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. This was a disaster. The painting was not a masterpiece. It was a copy. But it was a very good copy. Only a professional artist with a lot of skill could do this. He looked at the gold frame again. The frame was real and very old. The thief was very smart. They took the real painting out of the frame and put a fake one in its place. Suddenly, a hand touched Robert's shoulder. He jumped and almost dropped his magnifying glass. He turned around quickly. It was Clara. Her face was very white. She looked like she was going to faint. "What do you see, Robert?" she asked. Her voice was shaking. Robert looked into her eyes. He wanted to lie to make her feel better, but he could not. He was a man of truth when it came to art. "Clara," Robert said quietly, "this is not the painting I saw 5 years ago. This is a lie. This is a fake." Clara covered her mouth with her hand. She looked around the room to see if anyone heard him. "Are you sure?" 100%, Robert said. "We have a very big problem." Clara's eyes were full of tears. She looked at the painting, then back at Robert. She could not believe it. This painting was her gallery's most important treasure. If the painting was a fake, her business was finished. She would lose everything. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "The security is the best in the city. Simon is always here. The cameras are always on." "I don't know how," Robert said. "But the person who did this is an expert. They knew exactly what to do. They even used the old frame to hide the lie." Clara looked around the room. There were 50 people in the gallery. Most of them were rich and famous. They were laughing and talking. They had no idea that a crime was happening right in front of them. Clara saw Mr. White. He was standing near the door, looking at his gold watch. He looked like he wanted to leave. Suddenly, Clara's face became hard. She was no longer crying. She looked like a woman who was ready to fight. "If the painting was switched tonight, then the real one is still in this building," she said. "And the thief is still in this room." "Clara, wait," Robert said. "What are you doing?" Clara did not answer. She walked quickly to a small silver panel on the wall near the painting. She pulled a small key from her neck chain. She put the key into the panel and turned it. Then, she pressed a big red button. Immediately, a very loud and sharp sound filled the gallery. It was the emergency alarm. The sound was so high that people had to cover their ears with their hands. Then, something happened that Robert had never seen before. Huge, heavy steel doors began to slide down from the ceiling. They covered the glass entrance. They covered the windows. They covered the back exits. A heavy sound of metal hitting the marble floor echoed through the hall as the doors closed completely. The music stopped. The guests stopped talking. For a moment, there was total silence. Then, people began to shout. "What is happening?" a man yelled. "Open the doors," a woman cried. Simon, the security guard, ran to the middle of the room. He looked confused. He looked at Clara. Why did you close the doors? Is there a fire?" Clara stood tall. She looked at all the guests. Her voice was steady and cold. "Nobody is leaving this gallery," she said. "A very valuable object has been stolen. We are staying here until the police arrive and we find the truth." Robert looked at the guests. Some looked angry. Some looked afraid. But he noticed one person who did not look surprised. Mr. White stood perfectly still. He adjusted his white silk glove and looked at Robert with a strange, dark smile. Robert realized they were now trapped in a beautiful cage with a dangerous criminal. The room was full of noise. People were very angry. Some men went to the large steel doors and hit the metal with their hands. The doors did not move. They were thick and strong. "Let us out," a man in a tuxedo shouted. "This is crazy. You cannot keep us here." Clara stood her ground. She did not look afraid of the angry crowd. "I am sorry for the trouble," she said loudly. "But a crime happened tonight. The police are on their way. Until they arrive, no one leaves." Robert did not join the crowd. Instead, he looked at Simon, the security guard. Simon was standing near the empty purple curtain. He looked very different now. Usually, Simon was a very calm man. He was tall and had big shoulders. But now, his face was very pale. He was wiping sweat from his forehead with a blue handkerchief. His hands were shaking. Robert walked over to him. "Simon," Robert said in a low voice. "Are you okay?" Simon jumped a little when he heard Robert's voice. He looked around quickly. "Yes, Mr. Miller. I am surprised. I don't know how this happened." "You are the head of security," Robert said. He looked at Simon's belt. There were many tools there. There was a radio, a heavy flashlight, and a set of keys. But Robert noticed that one hook on the belt was empty. "Where is your master keycard, Simon?" Simon's hand went to his belt. He felt the empty spot and his eyes went wide. I don't know. It was here an hour ago. I must have dropped it." "Dropped it?" Robert asked. He did not believe him. A master keycard is very important. It opens every door in this building. It even opens the security room. Simon looked at the floor. He did not want to look at Robert. It was a busy night, Mr. Miller. Many people were moving around. Maybe someone bumped into me and took it. Robert looked at Simon's shoes. There was a small bit of white dust on the black leather. Robert knew that dust. It was plaster dust, the kind of dust you find when someone is working on a wall or a ceiling. There was no construction in the main gallery. "Where were you during the dinner, Simon?" Robert asked. "I was patrolling the hallway," Simon replied quickly. Too quickly. "I was checking the back exits." "Did you see anyone near the painting?" "No," Simon said. "The lights were bright. I didn't see anything strange." Robert remembered the white silk glove on Mr. White's hand and the blue stain. Now he saw Simon's shaking hands and the missing keycard. He also remembered that someone had to turn off the cameras. Simon was the only one with the code for the cameras. "Simon," Robert said quietly. "If you know something, you should tell Clara now. It will be worse when the police arrive." Simon opened his mouth to speak, but suddenly, the lights in the gallery flickered. They went from bright yellow to a dim orange. Then, the lights turned off completely. The gallery was in total darkness. The darkness was like a thick blanket. Robert could not see his own hands. In the main hall, the guests were panicking. He heard the sound of a glass breaking on the floor. People were shouting and moving around in the dark. A woman cried out in fear. A man's heavy footsteps moved quickly past Robert. "Stay still, everyone." Simon's voice boomed across the room, but no one listened. Robert felt a small, cold hand grab his arm. He jumped. "Robert, it is me," Clara whispered. Her voice was right next to his ear. "I have a small light." A tiny beam of light appeared. Clara was holding a small silver pen light. It was not very bright, but it was enough to see her pale face. She looked terrified. "The power is cut," Clara said. "The security room has its own battery. It should still have power. We need to go there now. I want to see those cameras." "Can we get there in the dark?" Robert asked. "Follow me," Clara said. "I know this gallery better than anyone." They moved slowly through the crowd. People were bumping into them. Robert felt the cold marble of a statue as they passed it. Clara led him to the back of the room, behind a large stone sculpture of a horse. She pushed a hidden part of the wall, and a small wooden door opened. They stepped into a narrow hallway. Here, it was very quiet. The noise of the guests felt far away. Clara walked quickly. The small light from her pen moved across the walls. They reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hall. This was the security office. Clara took out her set of keys. Her hands were shaking so much that she dropped them. The metal keys made a sharp, ringing sound on the floor. "Let me help," Robert said. He picked up the keys and found the one for the office. He put it in the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft click. Inside the security office, it was dim. There were 6 large computer screens on the wall. 4 of the screens were black. They were dead. But 2 screens were flickering with a dull, grey light. There was a small desk with a chair and many buttons. "Look," Robert said, pointing at the 2 working screens. The screens showed the main gallery. Because it was dark, the images were in green and black. It was the night vision mode. Robert saw the guests standing in the middle of the room. They looked like ghosts moving in the green light. "Can we see the recording from 10 minutes ago?" Robert asked. "I want to see the moment the lights went out for the first time." Clara sat in the chair. She began to type on the keyboard. Her eyes were fixed on the monitors. "The system is slow because of the power cut," she said. Suddenly, the screen changed. It showed the gallery when the lights were still on. They saw the guests talking and drinking. They saw the sunlight painting in its golden frame. "Wait," Robert said. "Look at the corner of the screen, near the ventilation vent." They watched the screen. A shadow moved near the ceiling. It was a person, but they were wearing dark clothes and a mask. Then, the screen went black. The cameras stopped. Clara cried. Someone turned them off from inside this room. The 2 screens in the security room continued to flicker. The green light made everything look strange and cold. Robert looked at the clock on the wall. It was not working. The power cut had stopped the hands of the clock at exactly 8:30. "Clara, look at the computer log," Robert said. He pointed to a small screen on the desk. Clara leaned forward. Her face was very close to the monitor. She moved the computer mouse slowly. "The system says the cameras stopped at 8:15, she said. "That was 10 minutes after I opened the curtain. That was when everyone was looking at the painting." "And when did they turn back on?" Robert asked. They didn't, Clara replied. The system shows a manual override. Someone used a physical key to stop the recording. But only Simon and I have that key. Robert looked around the small, messy room. There were jackets on hooks and empty coffee cups on the table. He felt that something was wrong. He knelt on the floor and looked under the heavy wooden desk. He saw a small piece of white paper. It was crumpled into a ball. He picked it up and smoothed it out on the desk. It was a torn piece of a letter. The paper was expensive and thick. It was not the kind of paper a security guard usually used. What is that? Clara asked. Robert held the paper under the light of the computer screen. There were only a few words written in red ink. The handwriting was very elegant and neat. The paper said, "At 9 o'clock. Do not forget the frame. The window will be open." 9 o'clock. Robert looked at his watch. It was a manual watch, and it was still ticking. It was now 8:45. We only have 15 minutes before something else happens. And look at the bottom, Clara said. She pointed to a small mark on the paper. In the corner of the torn letter, there was a small blue stain. Robert's eyes widened. It was the same blue paint he saw on the painting. It was the same blue stain he saw on Mr. White's shirt cuff. This letter belongs to the thief, Robert said. They were in this room. They turned off the cameras and then they dropped this. Suddenly, Robert heard a faint sound. It was the sound of a heavy weight moving against stone. It came from behind the large metal cabinet where the extra security monitors were kept. Robert moved to the cabinet. He pushed it with his shoulder. The cabinet was very heavy, but it moved a few inches. Behind it, the wallpaper was torn. There was no stone wall there. Instead, there was a dark opening. "Clara, look," Robert whispered. "A secret passage." The opening was small and narrow. A cold wind came out of the darkness. It smelled like old dust and fresh paint. Robert realized that the thief did not need to use the main doors. They had their own way to move through the gallery. Robert stood in front of the dark opening behind the cabinet. He felt a cold wind on his face. The air smelled like old stone and wet earth. He took the small penlight from Clara. He needed to see what was inside the wall. "I'm going in," Robert said. "Be careful," Clara whispered. She stayed near the door of the security office. She was watching the hallway. Robert stepped into the dark hole. He had to bend his head because the ceiling was very low. The walls were made of old red bricks. He saw spider webs in the corners. The floor was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Robert looked down at the dust. He saw a set of footprints. They were large, like the shoes of a tall man. The footprints went deeper into the darkness. He walked slowly for a few minutes. The passage was very narrow. He felt like the walls were closing in on him. Suddenly, he saw a small line of light ahead. He moved toward it. The passage ended at a large wooden panel. Robert put his ear against the wood. He heard the distant sound of people talking. He heard the angry voices of the guests in the main hall. He realized he was back in the gallery, but he was inside the wall. He pushed the wooden panel very gently. It moved without a sound. He stepped out and realized where he was. He was standing behind the large stone sculpture of the horse. This was the center of the gallery. From here, he could see the whole room, but no one could see him because of the heavy stone horse. He looked at the base of the wall behind the sculpture. He saw a small metal door. It was painted the same color as the wall, so it was very hard to see. It was a service door used for cleaning the building. Normally, this door was locked with a heavy bolt. But now, the bolt was pulled back. The door was open a few centimeters. Robert knelt down and looked at the door handle. He saw a small piece of blue thread caught in the metal. It was a bright, synthetic blue thread. He remembered the blue stain on Mr. White's shirt and the blue paint on the fake painting. The thief came through here, Robert thought. He looked at his watch. It was almost 9 o'clock. He remembered the note. At 9 o'clock. Do not forget the frame. Suddenly, the big clock in the hallway began to strike the hour. The sound was loud and heavy. Robert watched the guests. Everyone was looking at the steel doors, waiting for the police. No one was looking at the gold frame of the painting. As the clock finished, Robert saw a movement near the ventilation vent above the painting. A small, thin wire began to come down from the ceiling. It was moving toward the golden frame. Robert realized the theft was not finished. The thief had the painting, and now they wanted the gold frame too. The thin silver wire continued to drop from the ceiling. It had a small metal hook at the end. Robert stood behind the stone horse and watched. The hook touched the top of the heavy golden frame. It was like a fisherman waiting for a fish. Robert knew he could not stay here. He needed help to stop the thief. He turned around and went back through the small service door. He entered the narrow passage behind the wall again. He walked quickly through the dark. He reached the security office and found Clara. She was still standing by the monitor, her face pale in the green light. "Clara, I saw a wire," Robert said. He was breathing fast. "The thief is trying to take the golden frame now. It is happening at the top of the wall." Clara's eyes went wide. "The frame is worth almost as much as the painting. It is made of solid gold and rare wood. We must stop them. There is a hallway behind the wall," Robert explained. "It leads upward. I think the thief is above the gallery, in the maintenance level." Clara grabbed her heavy ring of keys and a larger flashlight. "Follow me. There is a service stairs near the back of this office." They left the security room and entered a different door. This door led to a dark, narrow hallway that Robert had not seen before. The walls were made of cold grey concrete. The air was very chilly here. Clara turned on her flashlight. The bright beam of light cut through the shadows. "This hallway goes around the whole gallery," Clara whispered. "Only the staff and the builders know about it." They walked quietly on the concrete floor. Robert looked at the ground. He saw more of the white plaster dust. He also saw a small black object on the floor. He stopped and picked it up. It was a small piece of plastic. It looked like a part of a broken walkie-talkie. "The thief is not alone," Robert said. "They are talking to someone." Clara looked worried. "If there are two of them, we are in danger." They reached a set of metal stairs. The stairs were very steep. Robert could hear a low humming sound coming from above. It was the sound of a small electric motor. He knew that motor was pulling the silver wire. "We need to be silent," Robert whispered. He took the lead. He climbed the metal stairs one step at a time. The metal felt cold under his hands. Every time he moved, the stairs made a small groaning sound. He prayed the thief would not hear them. When they reached the top of the stairs, they found a small metal platform. From here, they could see the ventilation shafts. There was a large square hole in the floor. Robert looked through the hole. He was looking directly down at the sunlight painting. The golden frame was only a few meters below them. Suddenly, the humming sound stopped. Robert looked to his right. In the shadows of the maintenance room, he saw a tall figure. The person was wearing a black jumpsuit and a mask. They were holding a remote control. The figure in the black jumpsuit froze. The bright beam of Clara's flashlight hit the person's mask for a second. The thief did not say a word. They quickly turned around and ran into the deep shadows of the maintenance room. "Stop!" Robert shouted. His voice echoed against the metal pipes and the concrete walls. He and Clara ran after the figure. The floor was narrow and dangerous. There were many cables and pipes on the ground. Robert had to watch his feet so he did not fall. The thief was very fast. They knew the way through the dark perfectly. The sound of running feet was loud and fast in the small space. Robert reached a corner and saw a heavy metal door closing. He ran to the door and pulled the handle with all his strength. But the door did not move. It was locked from the other side. The thief was gone. They escaped. Clara said. She was breathing hard. She leaned against the wall and tried to catch her breath. We lost them. Robert. Robert did not answer. He looked down at the floor near the locked door. The floor was covered in grey dust, but something clean and bright lay there. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a white silk glove. It felt very soft and looked very expensive. Look at this, Robert said. He held the glove up so Clara could see it in the light of the flashlight. Clara looked at the glove and frowned. I recognize that. I saw a guest wearing gloves like that tonight. Mr. White. Robert said immediately. I remember him clearly. He was wearing one white glove on his right hand. His left hand was bare. He kept it behind his back. Robert turned the glove over in his hands. It was a glove for a left hand. This was a very important piece of the puzzle. If the thief dropped this glove, then the thief was likely Mr. White, or someone working very closely with him. But Mr. White is a billionaire. Clara said. Why would he steal a painting? He has enough money to buy 10 galleries. Maybe he does not want to spend his money. Robert replied. Or maybe there is something about the real painting that he wants to hide. He looked at the inside of the glove's wrist. There was a small label with 2 letters written in black thread. J.W. Julian White. Robert whispered. Suddenly, they heard a noise from below. It was the sound of the guests again. The people in the main hall were getting louder and more upset. The sound of many voices talking at once rose up through the ventilation shafts. They were frustrated and tired of being trapped in the dark gallery. We need to go back down. Clara said. If the guests get too angry, they might try to break the doors or the windows. We must keep everyone calm until the police arrive. Robert put the white silk glove into his suit pocket. He now had the secret note and the glove. The mystery was growing. He had a fake painting, a missing keycard, a secret passage, and now a lost glove. He needed to find Mr. White in the crowd and look at his hands again. Robert and Clara walked down the cold stairs. The sound of the guests' voices became louder with every step. When they opened the small door behind the horse sculpture, the heat of the room hit them. The emergency lights were still dim and orange. The room felt small because of the many people inside. There they are. A man shouted. He was a famous actor who was a guest. He looked very angry. His face was red, and he was waving his hands in the air. A woman named Julia walked toward them. She was wearing a beautiful black dress, but her hair was messy now. She looked very tired and worried. Clara, you must tell us what is happening. We have been in the dark for a long time. Some people are feeling sick. We want to go home. The police are coming. Clara said. She tried to sound calm, but her voice was weak. She put her hands behind her back so the guests could not see them shaking. The city had a power problem, and our system is rebooting. Please be patient and stay in the main hall. Robert did not listen to the conversation. He moved through the crowd of adults. He kept his hand in his suit pocket. He touched the soft silk glove he found upstairs. He looked at every person's hands very carefully. He saw gold rings and expensive watches. He saw people holding their phones. But he did not see any white gloves. Finally, he saw Mr. White. The billionaire was sitting on a velvet chair near the drink table. He was holding a glass of water. He looked perfectly calm. He was the only person in the room who did not look angry or afraid. Robert walked closer to him. Mr. White looked up and smiled at Robert. "Ah, Mr. Miller. You look like you have been working hard. There is grey dust on your expensive suit." Robert looked at Mr. White's hands. Both hands were now bare. There was no white glove on his right hand anymore. His fingers were long and thin. Robert looked at his right cuff. The small blue stain was still there on the white fabric of his shirt. "I was looking at the ventilation system," Robert said. "The air is a bit heavy in here. I wanted to see if the fans were working." "Yes, it is very heavy," Mr. White agreed. "This gallery is like a tomb tonight. It is a very expensive tomb, but a tomb nonetheless." Robert noticed something on the floor near Mr. White's shiny black shoes. There was a small pile of something white and soft. Robert leaned in a little. It was not dust. It was tiny pieces of a white silk glove. Someone had cut the other glove into very small bits with a pair of scissors. Robert felt a chill. Mr. White was very clever. He knew he had lost one glove in the maintenance room. He did not want to be seen with only one glove, so he destroyed the second one. He thought he was hiding the evidence. But he was too late. Robert already had the first glove in his pocket. "Why are you looking at the floor, Robert?" Mr. White asked. His voice was low and cold. "Are you looking for something you lost?" "No," Robert replied. He looked directly into the man's dark eyes. "I think I found exactly what I was looking for." Suddenly, a loud voice came from the front of the room. It was Simon, the security guard. "Everyone, look at the painting. Something is happening." Everyone ran toward the wall. The guests pushed each other to see the masterpiece. The orange emergency lights made long, dancing shadows on the floor. Robert arrived at the front of the crowd. He looked up at the sunlight painting. The painting was no longer straight. The heavy golden frame was hanging by only one corner. It looked like it was about to fall. The silver wire that Robert saw earlier was now visible to everyone. It was caught in the top of the frame. The hook was stuck in the wood. The frame. "It is moving," Julia cried out. She stepped back, afraid the heavy gold would hit her. Robert looked at the wall behind the frame. Now that the painting was tilted, he could see something hidden. There was a small, square hole in the white stone wall. It was a secret safe, and the door of the safe was open. It was empty. "Clara, look," Robert said. He pointed at the hole. Clara looked like she was going to faint. "That safe, only a few people know about it. It is where we keep the original documents for the painting." Robert leaned closer. He did not touch the frame, but he looked at the wire. It was a very strong wire. Then, he looked at the guests again. He wanted to see their reactions. Most people looked shocked, but he noticed that Mr. White was standing very still. He was not looking at the painting. He was looking at Robert's pocket. Robert realized that Mr. White knew. The billionaire knew that Robert had found the silk glove. "Simon," Robert called out. The security guard walked over. He was still shaking. "Who has the keys to the ventilation room?" "The wire is coming from there." I have the only set," Simon said. He reached for his belt. He pulled out a large ring of keys. But then he stopped. He looked at the keys with a confused face. "Wait. One key is missing. The small silver one." Robert felt the mystery growing. The thief had Simon's master keycard and now one of his keys. The thief was always one step ahead. "Clara," Robert said quietly. "Look at Mr. White's hands again." Clara looked. She saw that his hands were bare. She remembered seeing him with a glove earlier in the evening. She looked at Robert with a question in her eyes. "I found the other one upstairs," Robert whispered. "He is hiding something." Suddenly, a woman screamed. It was not a loud sound, but it was full of fear. She was pointing at the floor near the buffet table. Robert and Clara ran over to her. On the white marble floor, there was a trail of wet, blue footprints. They were small footprints, like they belonged to a woman. They led away from the painting and toward the kitchen doors at the back of the gallery. Robert looked at the blue paint. It was the same bright blue from the fake painting. He looked at the guests. He looked at Julia, then at the art student, Mia. Everyone was wearing dark shoes. It was hard to see the paint in the dim light. "The thief is moving," Robert said. "We need to follow those marks." Robert and Clara followed the blue footprints. The marks were small and narrow. They looked like they were made by a woman's shoe with a thin heel. The trail led through the crowd and stopped at the heavy swinging doors of the gallery kitchen. "Wait," Clara said. She looked at the guests. They were still looking at the hanging gold frame. No one was paying attention to the kitchen. "Before we go in there, we must call for help. I thought the police were already coming because of the alarm, but it has been 20 minutes. No one has arrived." Robert reached into his suit pocket. He pulled out his mobile phone. He looked at the screen. The small bars in the corner were gone. "I have no signal," Robert said. He held the phone up high, but the screen did not change. "The steel doors are too thick. They are blocking the signal from the outside world." Clara pulled her own phone from her red bag. She tried to make a call, but she shook her head. "Mine is the same. It is dead. This building is like a giant metal box now. Nothing can get in or out." "Is there a landline?" Robert asked. "A phone with a wire?" "Yes, in the hallway near the kitchen," Clara replied. She walked quickly to a small desk near the wall. A classic black telephone sat there. She picked up the receiver and put it to her ear. She stood still for a few seconds. Her face became even paler. She slowly put the phone back down. "The line is quiet," she whispered. "The wires have been cut. Someone did this on purpose." Robert felt a cold fear in his chest. This was not a simple theft. The thief was very prepared. They had blocked the phones, cut the power, and locked the doors. The 50 people in the room were completely alone with the criminal. "We are trapped, Robert," Clara said. Her voice was very small. "We cannot call the police. We cannot call the fire department. We are in the dark, and we don't know who to trust." Robert looked at the kitchen doors. The blue footprints went under the wood and into the darkness of the service area. He thought about the rich guests in the room. He thought about Mr. White and his missing glove. He thought about the art student, Mia, and her paintbrushes. "We have to solve this ourselves, Clara," Robert said. He felt a new strength. He was not just an art restorer anymore. He was a detective. "The thief is here. They want the painting and the frame. If we find the real sunlight painting, we find the thief." He looked at his watch. It was 9:15. The air in the gallery was getting warmer. The smell of the food was starting to mix with the sharp smell of chemicals from the kitchen. "Let's go," Robert said. He pushed the swinging doors open. The kitchen was dark and silent. The silver tables and large ovens looked like strange monsters in the shadows. Robert and Clara stepped into the kitchen. The room was large and full of silver tables. The smell of cold soup and expensive meat was very strong. Robert moved the flashlight slowly across the room. The light reflected off the metal surfaces, making bright spots on the dark walls. Suddenly, A sharp sound of breaking glass echoed in the large room. Robert and Clara both stopped. They stood perfectly still and listened. For a moment, there was no other sound. The kitchen was as quiet as a grave. "Who is there?" Clara asked. Her voice was small and full of fear. No one answered. Robert moved the beam of his light toward the back of the kitchen. Near a large refrigerator, he saw something shining on the floor. He walked toward it carefully. His shoes made a soft tapping sound on the hard floor. He reached the spot and looked down. A wine glass lay in hundreds of tiny pieces on the floor. Next to the glass, there was a large puddle of red wine. The liquid looked dark, almost like blood, in the dim light of the flashlight. "It is just a glass," Robert whispered. But then he looked closer. "Wait. Look at the floor." The floor around the broken glass was very wet. There were more blue footprints here. But these footprints were messy. It looked like someone had slipped on the wet floor and fell. Robert saw a handprint in the red wine. It was a small handprint. Someone was here only a minute ago. Robert said, "The wine is still moving. They are hiding in this kitchen." He moved his light to a row of tall cabinets. One of the cabinet doors was not completely closed. It was moving back and forth very slowly. Robert felt his heart beating fast in his chest. He walked to the cabinet and reached for the handle. "Robert, be careful," Clara warned. She stood behind him, holding a heavy silver tray. She wanted to use it as a shield. Robert pulled the cabinet door open quickly. Inside, there were only stacks of white plates and clean towels. But on one of the white towels, there was a fresh blue stain. It was a smear of paint, as if someone had wiped their hands in a hurry. Robert looked at the floor again. The blue footprints continued past the cabinets and led to a small elevator in the corner. This was a dumbwaiter, a small elevator used to move food and dishes between floors. The thief went down, Robert said. He looked at the buttons on the wall next to the small elevator. The light for the basement was glowing a faint red. The basement is where we keep the old crates and the cleaning supplies, Clara said. It is a very big area. It is like a maze down there. Robert looked at the small elevator. It was too small for a person to fit inside. But it was the perfect size for a heavy golden frame and a masterpiece painting. Robert and Clara left the dark kitchen and returned to the main hall. The air in the gallery was heavy and warm. The guests were sitting on the floor or leaning against the walls. They were no longer shouting. They were tired. Simon, the security guard, was sitting on a small wooden bench near the empty golden frame. He held his head in his hands. Robert walked up to him. "Simon, we found something in the kitchen. There is blue paint on the service elevator. Someone is moving things to the basement." Simon looked up. His eyes were red, and his face looked older than before. "I am a failure, Mr. Miller. I have worked here for 10 years. Nothing ever happens. Tonight, everything went wrong. Tell us what you saw, Simon," Clara said. She sat next to him on the bench. Before the lights went out for the first time. "Think carefully." Simon took a deep breath. He looked at the empty space on the wall. It was right after the curtain fell. Everyone was looking at the painting. I was standing near the entrance. I saw a woman move away from the crowd. She did not look at the art. She was looking at the ceiling. "A woman?" Robert asked. "What did she look like?" "She wore a dark dress," Simon replied. "It was long and black. She had a small silver bag. I thought she was going to the bathroom, so I did not stop her. But she did not go to the hallway. She went behind the horse sculpture." Robert looked at the stone horse. That was where he found the secret door. "Did you see her face?" Simon shook his head. No. She moved very fast. But I saw her shoes. They were very thin and high. They made a sharp clicking sound on the marble. A few minutes later, the lights flickered and the first alarm started. Robert thought about the guests. Julia was wearing a black dress. Mia, the art student, was also wearing dark clothes. Many women in the room had long dresses. Simon. Robert said, looking at the guard's belt. Why did you not tell us this earlier? Simon looked at the floor. I was afraid. I realized my master keycard was gone at that same moment. I thought if I said something, you would think I helped her. I am just a guard. Clara. I don't have money for a lawyer. We are not here to punish you yet. Simon. Robert said. But we need the truth. Did you see her carry anything? She had a heavy jacket over her arm. Simon said. It was a man's jacket. A dark blue one. Robert remembered Mr. White. The billionaire was wearing a dark blue suit, but he was not wearing his jacket now. He was only in his white shirt with the blue stain. The jacket was used to hide the painting. Robert whispered to Clara. They are working together. The woman took the painting, and the man stayed here to watch us. But who is the woman? Clara asked. Robert looked across the room. He saw Julia talking to Mr. White. They looked like friends. Julia was wearing thin, high shoes. Robert looked at the floor near her feet. In the dim orange light, he saw a small, dark shadow on the side of her left shoe. It was a tiny drop of blue paint. Robert looked at the blue paint on Julia's shoe. Then he looked at the kitchen doors. He knew the answer was downstairs. He turned to Clara. Her face was tired, but her eyes were sharp. She understood what they had to do. We must go to the basement. Robert said. If the thief used the service elevator, the painting is down there right now. Clara nodded. She led Robert to a small, heavy door behind the drink table. This door was different from the others. It was made of thick iron and painted grey. Clara used a long silver key from her ring. She turned the key, and the lock made a heavy, clicking sound. This is the only way down. Clara whispered. The stairs are very old. Please be careful. She opened the door. A wave of cold, damp air hit Robert's face. It smelled like wet stone and old wood. Robert turned on his flashlight. The bright beam showed a set of narrow stone stairs. The steps were uneven and dusty. Robert went first. He held the cold metal rail with one hand and the flashlight with the other. Every step they took made a low, hollow sound that echoed up the stairs. The walls were wet, and small drops of water ran down the stones. How many floors are below us? Robert asked. Just one. Clara replied. But the basement is as big as the gallery. We use it to store old frames, wooden crates, and the tools I use to hang the art. It is a very messy place. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, Robert moved his light around the room. The basement was full of tall shadows. Huge wooden boxes were stacked everywhere. Some boxes were open, and white packing paper spilled out onto the floor like snow. Robert looked at the ground near the bottom of the stairs. He saw a fresh mark in the dust. It was a long, straight line, as if someone had dragged a heavy object across the floor. Look. Robert pointed the light at the line. They moved something heavy this way. They followed the line past a row of tall shelves. The shelves were filled with old statues and empty glass bottles. Suddenly, the flashlight hit a large, blue object on the floor. Robert walked faster. It was not a painting. It was a dark blue suit jacket. Robert picked it up. It was heavy and felt like expensive wool. He looked at the label inside the neck. It said, White & Sons. This is Mr. White's jacket. Robert said, Simon was right. The woman used this to hide the painting. Robert put his hand into the pocket of the jacket. He felt something hard and cold. He pulled it out. It was a small, black electronic device with a long antenna. It was a signal jammer. "This is why our phones don't work," Robert said. "This machine blocks all the signals." The thief put it in the jacket and left it here. Robert pressed a small button on the side of the device. A tiny red light turned off. "Check your phone, Clara," Robert said. Clara pulled out her phone. She waited for a few seconds. Still nothing. She said, "The steel doors are still closed. The jammer was only part of the problem. We are still trapped." Robert looked deeper into the basement. The maze of crates continued into the darkness. He knew the thief was still there, hiding among the shadows of the old art. Robert and Clara moved further into the deep basement. The flashlight beam was like a small sun in the dark world. It hit the corners of old frames and pieces of white cloth. The basement was a maze. They had to turn left and right between the tall stacks of wooden boxes. "Wait," Robert said. He stopped walking and held up his hand. "Do you smell that?" Clara sniffed the air. "It smells like chemicals and oil. It is the smell of fresh oil paint," Robert said. "And paint thinner. It is very strong here." They followed the smell. It led them to a very large wooden crate in the center of a small clearing. The crate was made of clean, light brown wood. It was much newer than the other boxes in the basement. On the side of the crate, there were black letters. "Fragile. Handle with care." Robert moved his flashlight over the top of the box. The wooden lid was sitting on the floor next to it. Someone had used a tool to pull the nails out. Robert stepped closer and looked inside. The crate was completely empty. "There is nothing here," Clara said. She looked disappointed. "I thought we would find the painting." Robert reached his hand into the crate. He touched the wooden bottom. It felt slightly sticky. He brought his fingers to his nose. "The paint is still wet, Clara." This crate did not hold an old masterpiece. It held the fake painting. "So the thief brought the fake in this box?" Clara asked. "Yes," Robert replied. "They brought the fake here before the party started. They hid it in this basement. Then, during the party, someone brought the fake up and took the real sunlight down." Robert looked around the floor. He saw a small piece of blue tape near the empty crate. He picked it up. It was the same bright blue as the paint on the fake painting he saw upstairs. "But if the fake was in here," Clara whispered, "where is the real painting now?" Robert looked at the empty space in the crate. He felt a sense of urgency. The real painting was not in the box, and it was not on the wall. That meant the thief was still moving it through the building. Suddenly, Robert saw something strange on the back wall of the basement. There was a shadow that did not match the shapes of the boxes. It was a long, thin shadow that looked like a person standing very still. Robert turned the flashlight toward the shadow. "Who is there?" he called out. The shadow moved quickly. It disappeared behind a stack of heavy frames. Robert and Clara heard the sound of quick footsteps on the concrete floor. The person was running away from them, deeper into the dark corners of the basement. "Follow them," Robert shouted. They ran past the empty crate, their shadows dancing on the walls. The chase was difficult. The basement was very dark and full of dust. Robert's flashlight made a thin path of light in the shadows. He and Clara ran past tall stacks of old paintings and heavy furniture. They turned a corner, but the shadow was gone. They were now in a small hallway with 3 wooden doors. "Where did they go?" Clara asked. She was breathing very hard and her face was red. Robert stopped and listened. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then, he heard a small noise. It was the sound of someone hitting a wooden surface. It was not a loud noise, but it was steady. Someone was trying to get attention. He moved his light to the door on the left. It was a small storage closet. He reached for the handle and turned it. It did not move. The door was locked from the outside with a heavy metal bolt. "Is someone in there?" Robert asked loudly. A muffled voice answered from behind the door. "Please, help me. Open the door." It was a woman's voice. It sounded like Julia, the guest they saw earlier. Robert looked at Clara. "We need to open this. Do you have the key?" Clara looked at her large ring of keys. Her hands were shaking. "This door usually stays open. I think I have the key, but I'm not sure." She tried 3 different keys. None of them worked. Finally, the 4th key turned in the lock. Robert pulled the door open. The light from his flashlight filled the small room. Inside the closet, there were cleaning supplies, old buckets, and tall brooms. A woman was sitting on the floor in the corner. Her hands were tied behind her back with a long, blue silk ribbon. Her mouth was covered with a piece of dark cloth. "Julia!" Clara cried. She knelt down and carefully removed the cloth from the woman's mouth. Julia took a deep breath and coughed. Her eyes were wide and full of fear. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very weak. "I thought no one would find me." Robert looked at her hands. He used a small pocket knife to cut the blue ribbon. He noticed the ribbon was exactly the same color as the paint on the fake painting upstairs. This was not a coincidence. "What happened, Julia?" Robert asked. "We saw blue paint on your shoes in the main hall. We thought you were the thief." Julia looked at her shoes and began to cry. "I am not a thief. I saw a man near the kitchen earlier. He was carrying a very heavy bag. I followed him because he looked suspicious. But he saw me. He was very fast. He grabbed me and pulled me down to the basement." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "He took my shoes and dipped them in a bucket of blue paint. He told me that everyone would think I was the criminal. Then he tied me up and locked me in here." "Did you see his face?" Robert asked. "No," Julia replied. "He was wearing a black mask. But he was tall and very strong. He had a deep voice." Robert felt a cold shiver. The thief was clever. He was using the guests to confuse Robert and Clara. He was creating fake clues while he moved the Real painting. He said the job was almost finished. Julia whispered. "He said he was waiting for the signal." Robert and Clara helped Julia out of the small closet. She was shaking, and her face was very pale. Robert found a clean wooden crate and helped her sit down. Clara gave her a small bottle of water from her bag. "Take your time, Julia," Robert said in a gentle voice. "We need to know exactly what happened." Julia drank some water and took a deep breath. She looked at the dark corners of the basement. It started before the lights went out. She began. "I was in the main hall. I was bored, so I was looking at the guests. I saw a man near the service doors. He was not a guest. He was wearing a dark blue suit, but he did not have a tie. He was carrying a very heavy bag. It was a long, black bag made of thick cloth." Robert listened carefully. A long, heavy bag was the perfect shape to hide a painting and its frame. "Where was he going?" Robert asked. "He was moving toward the kitchen," Julia said. "He looked very nervous. He kept looking at the large clock on the wall. I thought he was a worker, but his bag looked too strange. I followed him. That is when he saw me." She stopped for a moment. Her voice was very quiet now. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with cold eyes. Then, he grabbed my arm. He was very strong. He pulled me toward the basement door. He had a small radio in his hand. I heard a voice on the radio. It said one word. Now. Then the lights went out. And then he brought you down here? Clara asked. Yes. Julia nodded. In the dark, he pushed me down the stairs. I fell. That is how I got the blue paint on my shoes. There was a bucket of paint near the bottom of the stairs. I think he put it there on purpose. He pushed my feet into the paint. He wanted me to look like the thief. Robert thought about the timing. This man was the partner. While Mr. White stayed in the main hall to watch the guests, this man was moving the painting through the building. Did he have the bag with him in the basement? Robert asked. Yes. Julia said. But after he locked me in the closet, I heard a loud noise. It was the sound of the service elevator moving. I think he put the bag inside and sent it up. Robert looked at the metal cables of the elevator. They were silent now. The elevator goes to the roof. He said to Clara, if the bag is in the elevator, the painting is leaving the building. Robert looked at the floor near the elevator. He saw a small piece of black plastic. He picked it up. It was a button from a suit jacket. It was an expensive button, and it matched the blue jacket he found earlier. We have to go up. Robert said. The mystery is moving to the roof. Robert's small pen light started to flicker. The beam was no longer bright and yellow. It was now a pale, weak orange. Then, the light died completely. They were standing in total darkness again. The silence of the basement felt very heavy. I cannot see anything. Julia whispered. Her voice was full of fear. Is he coming back? Stay calm. Robert said. He put his hand out and touched the cold metal of a storage shelf. He moved his hands slowly across the metal surface. He remembered seeing a maintenance area near the elevator earlier. His fingers touched something hard and heavy. It felt like a thick handle. He pulled it toward him. It was a large, professional flashlight made of black metal. He felt a button on the side and pressed it. A very powerful, white beam of light cut through the dark. It was much stronger than the first light. It lit up the whole corner of the basement, showing every piece of dust in the air. Robert moved the light to the service elevator. The metal cables were still moving. They made a low, rhythmic sound as they pulled the small elevator car up to the very top of the building. The roof. Robert said. He watched the cables move higher. That is where they are going. There is a landing pad for a helicopter on the roof of the Grand Gallery. But the roof door is always locked. Clara said. Only the master keycard can open that door. Robert remembered the missing keycard from Simon's belt. Everything was clear now. The thief had planned every detail. They had the keys, they had the elevator, and they had a way to escape from the top of the building. Suddenly, the lights in the building changed. The dim orange emergency light became a deep, dark red. It was the color of a warning. A low, heavy sound of a siren echoed through the walls. It was a steady, pulsing sound that meant someone was trying to force a door open or a security barrier was broken. Someone is on the roof. Clara said. She looked up at the ceiling. They are trying to open the exit. We cannot use the elevator. Robert said. The car is already at the top. We have to use the emergency stairs. He looked at Julia. Can you walk? We need to get back to the main hall and then all the way up to the roof. Julia stood up slowly. Her legs were still shaking, but she nodded her head. I want to help. I want to see them get caught. Robert led the way. The heavy flashlight in his hand felt solid. He was tired of being the prey. He wanted to find the person who took the sunlight painting. They began to climb the long, spiraling stairs. The air became thinner and warmer as they went higher. Every step was a struggle. But Robert did not stop. He could feel the mystery reaching its end. Robert, Clara, and Julia reached the top of the basement stairs. They pushed open the heavy iron door and stepped back into the main hall of the gallery. The air was thick and smelled like old perfume and sweat. The red emergency lights were still pulsing, making the room look like it was under a dark sea. The guests were sitting in small groups on the marble floor. They looked like ghosts in the red light. When they saw Robert and Clara, a few people stood up. "Did you find a way out?" a man asked. He looked very tired. "Not yet," Robert said. "But we found Julia. She was locked in the basement." A murmur went through the crowd. Everyone looked at Julia. She was still wearing her blue-stained shoes. Mr. White stood up from his velvet chair. He looked at Julia with a sharp, cold gaze. He did not say anything, but his eyes were narrow. Suddenly, the pulsing red lights stopped. They did not flicker, they just died. The humming sound of the gallery's ventilation system also stopped. The silence was absolute for 1 second. Then, the gallery became completely dark. It was a darkness so deep that it felt heavy on Robert's chest. "The backup batteries are dead," Clara whispered. Her voice was full of despair. "Now the building is completely without power." Panic started in the hall. Without the red light, the guests felt even more trapped. Robert heard the sound of people running and bumping into furniture. A woman cried out as she fell. A man shouted for someone to open a window. The sounds of fear filled the large, black space. "Stay where you are," Simon the guard yelled. But no one listened to him in the dark. Robert remembered the heavy-duty flashlight in his hand. He felt the cold metal button and pressed it. A thick, brilliant beam of white light shot across the room. It was so bright that it made the dust in the air look like floating silver. Robert moved the light around the room. He saw the guests covering their eyes. He saw the empty wall where the painting used to be. Then, he moved the light toward the back of the room, near the stairs that led to the upper offices. He saw a figure. It was a man. He was wearing a dark jumpsuit and carrying a long, black bag. The man was already halfway up the stairs. When the light hit him, he did not stop. He began to run faster. "There he is," Robert shouted. "The man with the painting." The thief reached the top of the stairs and disappeared into the hallway that led to the roof. Robert did not wait. He began to run through the crowd. He jumped over a small table and pushed past 2 guests. "Robert, wait," Clara called out. Robert did not stop. He reached the stairs and began to climb. He took 2 steps at a time. The powerful flashlight in his hand showed him the way. The walls of the upper hallway were white and clean. He could see fresh, blue handprints on the doors. The thief was in a hurry, and he was leaving a trail. Robert reached the end of the hallway. He saw a heavy steel door with a red sign, "Roof Access." The door was slightly open. A cold wind was blowing into the building from the outside. Robert stepped through the door and onto the roof. The roof was a flat, cold desert of gravel and metal. The wind was much stronger here, pulling at Robert's hair and jacket. Far below, the city was a sea of tiny, glittering lights. Robert felt small standing so high above the street. The air tasted of rain and city smoke. The thief was standing near the center of the roof, on the large yellow circle of the helicopter pad. He was holding the long black bag tightly against his chest. When he saw the beam of Robert's heavy flashlight, he moved toward the edge of the building. "Stop!" Robert yelled over the sound of the wind. "There is nowhere to go. The stairs are blocked, and you cannot jump from this height." The man in the black jumpsuit stopped. He was only 2 meters from the edge of the roof. He slowly turned around. The flashlight was so bright that Robert could see the man's eyes through his mask. They were cold, sharp, and desperate. "Give me the bag, and this is over," Robert said. He stepped forward slowly, keeping the light steady. He did not want the man to move toward the ledge. "The police will be here soon. You can't escape." The thief laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound that was nearly lost in the wind. "You think you've won, Miller? You're just a restorer. You fix old things. You don't understand how the world works now." He reached into the bag and pulled out a heavy object. It was not the canvas of a painting. It was the heavy golden frame Robert had seen hanging on the wall. The man held it up, and the gold sparkled brilliantly in the flashlight beam. "Where is the sunlight?" Robert demanded. "Where is the masterpiece?" The thief looked at the frame, then back at Robert. "The frame is the only thing that's real, Robert. The painting on the wall tonight was a fake, yes. But the masterpiece Clara has kept in her vault for 10 years. That was a fake too." Robert felt the world spinning. "What are you talking about? I saw that painting 5 years ago. It was authentic." "You saw a very good lie," the thief said, his voice rising over the wind. "The real sunlight was destroyed in a fire 30 years ago. Clara's father lied to keep the gallery famous. He had a master copy made. Mr. White didn't want the painting. He wanted this frame because it contains the original documents hidden in the wood, the proof of the lie." Suddenly, a loud humming sound came from the sky. A dark shape began to drop from the clouds. It was a small, silent helicopter with no lights. It was coming for the thief. "Goodbye, Mr. Miller," the thief said. He prepared to run toward the landing helicopter. But as the man moved, Robert noticed something. The thief's black jumpsuit was torn at the shoulder. Under the black fabric, Robert saw a flash of blue. It was a light blue shirt with a silver patch. It was a security guard's uniform. "Simon," Robert whispered, his heart sinking. The man in the black jumpsuit froze. The wind howled around them, a lonely and cold sound. Slowly, he reached up with one hand and pulled the dark mask from his face. It was Simon. The usually quiet, nervous guard looked different now. His eyes were no longer full of fear, they were full of anger and greed. "Simon," Robert said, his voice shaking. "Why?" "Clara trusted you. You've worked here for a decade. 10 years of watching rich people buy things they don't even look at." Simon spat. 10 years of being a ghost in a uniform. Mr. White offered me more money in one night than I would earn in a lifetime of guarding lies. Simon held the heavy golden frame tighter. The helicopter was now very close. The wind from its rotors pushed against them, blowing gravel across the roof like tiny bullets. The sound was deafening. "He told you the painting was a fake," Robert yelled over the roar. "He showed me the proof." Simon reached for a small metal catch hidden deep within the carvings of the frame's corner. With a sharp click, a thin piece of wood slid away. Inside the frame was a hollow space. Simon pulled out a yellowed, fragile piece of paper. "This is the original artist's letter to Clara's father," Simon shouted. "It explains that the real sunlight was ruined by water damage years ago. This frame is the only thing left from the original set. Mr. White wanted the document to destroy the gallery's reputation so he could buy the land for cheap." Robert realized the truth. The theft wasn't about the beauty of the art. It was about the power of the land the gallery stood on. Mr. White was a predator, and Simon was his claws. The helicopter hovered just meters above the landing pad. A rope ladder dropped down. Simon began to move toward it. He was clumsy with the heavy frame and the bag. He stumbled on the uneven gravel. "Simon, stop." Robert ran forward. He didn't think about the danger. He only thought about the history that was being stolen. Robert grabbed the edge of the black bag. Simon turned and swung his heavy flashlight at Robert's head. Robert ducked, the metal whistling past his ear. They struggled on the edge of the roof. The wind was trying to push them both into the dark abyss of the city below. Suddenly, the bag tore. The canvas of the fake painting, the one Robert had examined in the gallery, slipped out and was caught by the wind. It flew into the night like a giant, colorful bird. But Simon didn't care about the painting. He only cared about the frame and the paper inside. "It's over, Simon." Robert grabbed Simon's arm. At that moment, the roof door burst open. Clara and 2 city police officers ran out, their own flashlights cutting through the dark. The officers had their guns drawn. "Drop it, Simon," one of the officers shouted. Simon looked at the helicopter ladder, then at the police. He looked at the edge of the roof. For a second, Robert saw a flash of the old Simon, the man who was just a guard. Simon's face crumbled. He let go of the frame. It hit the gravel with a heavy thud. The helicopter, seeing the police, didn't wait. It pulled up sharply and disappeared into the clouds, leaving Simon alone in the white glare of the searchlights. The morning sun began to rise over the city, turning the sky the same shades of orange and pink that were once in the sunlight painting. The gallery was quiet now. The guests had gone home, and the heavy steel doors were finally open. The smell of cold air and rain had replaced the thick scent of perfume and panic. Simon was taken away in a police car, his head low. Downstairs, in the back of a black sedan, Mr. White sat in handcuffs. Robert had given the police the white silk glove and the signal jammer, with the blue paint on his cuff and the button missing from his jacket. The billionaire could no longer hide behind his money. He had underestimated the man who fixes the past. Robert and Clara stood in the center of the main hall. Between them, on a velvet table, lay the heavy golden frame and the fragile, yellowed letter. "My father always told me the light in that painting was a miracle," Clara said softly. Her eyes were tired, but she looked more peaceful than she had all night. "Now I know the miracle was how long he kept the secret. He didn't want the world to know he had lost the masterpiece. He thought the gallery would die without it. He was wrong," Robert said. He looked at the empty wall. "The gallery isn't just one painting. It's the history, the building, and the people who come here to feel something. A lie is a heavy thing to carry, Clara. Now, you don't have to." "What will happen now?" she asked. "We tell the truth," Robert replied. "We tell the story of the lost sunlight. People will come to see the empty frame and read the letter. In a way, the story of the theft and the secret is more interesting than the painting itself. It's real." Clara smiled for the first time in hours. "And you, Robert? Will you go back to your studio and your magnifying glass?" Robert looked at his hands. They were stained with dust and a tiny bit of blue paint. "I think I've had enough of fixing things for a while. I think I'll just spend some time looking at the real sun for a change." He walked toward the exit. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the first rays of the morning sun hit the marble steps of the Grand Gallery. It was bright, warm, and authentic. Robert Miller took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and started his walk home. The mystery was solved, the lie was over, and for the first time, everything was perfectly clear. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the Grand Gallery. Robert Miller's life had changed in ways he never expected. His small, quiet studio, which used to smell only of turpentine and old wood, was now filled with the scent of fresh flowers sent by grateful museum directors and stacks of newspapers with his face on the front page. The headlines called him the Eye of Truth and the man who saved the history. Robert sat at his wooden desk, drinking a cup of dark coffee. Outside, the city was waking up, the blue light of dawn filtering through his large windows. He looked at his workbench. For the first time in 20 years, there was no painting sitting on the easel. He felt a strange emptiness. He was an expert at fixing the past, but now that the truth of the sunlight was out, the past felt settled. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. It was early, too early for a client. Robert stood up, his joints popping. He opened the door and found a small, plain cardboard box sitting on the mat. There was no name on the box, only his address written in a very precise, mechanical hand. He brought the box inside and set it on his workbench. He used a small silver blade to cut the tape. Inside, he did not find a painting or a thank you note. He found a single, heavy iron key and a photograph. Robert picked up the photograph. It showed a painting he knew very well, the Mona Lisa. But it wasn't the version that hung in the Louvre. This version was slightly different. The woman in the painting was not smiling. She looked sad, and her eyes were a deep, haunting violet. On the back of the photo, a single sentence was written in red ink. The lie you found in the gallery was a child's toy. The real ghosts are waiting in Paris. Robert felt a cold shiver, the same one he felt when he spotted the fake blue paint on the sunlight. He looked at the iron key. It had a small tag with a room number, 402. Below the number was a symbol he had never seen before, a circle with a single vertical line through the center, like a closed eye. He realized then that the case of Mr. White and Simon was not the end. They were just workers for someone much more powerful, someone who was replacing the world's most famous treasures with ghosts. Robert looked at the phone on his desk. He thought about calling Clara, but he stopped. This was bigger than the Grand Gallery. This was a war for the soul of art itself. He went to his closet and pulled out his old leather suitcase. He didn't need his restoration tools for this trip. He needed his magnifying glass, his eyes, and a very thick coat. He was going to Paris. The flight to Paris was long and quiet. Robert spent the hours staring at the violet-eyed Mona Lisa in the photograph. As a restorer, he knew that Leonardo da Vinci often painted multiple versions of his work, but this felt different. This felt like a message. At the Charles de Gaulle airport, the air was cold and smelled of jet fuel and rain. Robert walked through the terminal, feeling the weight of the iron key in his pocket. As he reached the exit, a woman in a long grey trench coat stepped into his path. She had short, dark hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her accent was French, sharp and professional. "I am Agent Sarah Vance. Interpol, Art Crimes Division." Robert stopped, his hand tightening on the handle of his suitcase. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming here. We have been watching the Grand Gallery case very closely," Vance said, gesturing for him to follow her to a waiting black car. "Mr. White was part of a group we call the Syndicate of Shadows. They don't just steal art, Robert. They replace it. They want to own the originals while the world looks at the fakes. It is the ultimate power move, to own the truth while everyone else lives in a lie." They got into the car, and the driver pulled away into the grey Parisian morning. Vance opened a thick folder and handed it to Robert. Inside were dozens of photographs. Each one showed a famous masterpiece, a Van Gogh, a Vermeer, a Rembrandt. In the last 5 years, we suspect that over 20 major paintings in European museums have been switched. Vance said, "The copies are perfect. Even our best scientists can't find the difference. But you found the mistake in the sunlight because you look for the soul of the paint, not just the chemical makeup." Robert looked at the photos. His heart sank. If Vance was right, the history of art was being systematically erased. "Why me?" Robert asked. "You have experts. You have laboratories." "Because the syndicate has a master forger," Vance replied. "Someone we call the Alchemist. He doesn't just copy the paint, he copies the age. He uses 200-year-old oils and canvas. Our machines can't catch him. But you saw a blue fiber in a golden frame. You see the human errors." She looked at the iron key in Robert's hand. That key belongs to a hotel in the Latin Quarter. It was checked out by a man who died 3 days ago. He was a restorer, like you. He was trying to leave the syndicate. Robert looked out the window at the Eiffel Tower in the distance. He wasn't just a restorer anymore. He was the only person who could see the cracks in the world's most beautiful lies. The Hotel des Ambers was a narrow, ancient building tucked away in a cobblestone alley in the Latin Quarter. The walls were covered in ivy, and the windows were small and dark. Agent Vance stayed in the car, watching the street. Robert walked inside alone. He didn't want to look like a police operation. He wanted to look like a man keeping an appointment. The lobby was small and smelled of old paper and lavender. An elderly man sat behind a wooden desk, reading a newspaper. He didn't look up as Robert walked to the stairs. The wood groaned under his feet as he climbed to the 4th floor. Room 402 was at the very end of a dim hallway. Robert took the iron key from his pocket. His hand was steady, but his heart was racing. He put the key in the lock. It turned with a heavy, oily click. He pushed the door open. The room was not a hotel room. It was a mini laboratory. There were no beds or chairs, only long tables covered in glass jars, chemicals, and bundles of animal hairbrushes. The walls were covered in sketches of hands, eyes, and landscapes. Robert walked to the center table. In the middle of the mess was a single canvas, resting on a small easel. It was a painting of a simple wooden chair. It looked like a Van Gogh, but the colors were wrong. They were too dark, too cold. He took out his magnifying glass and leaned in. He wasn't looking for the chair. He was looking at the bottom right corner. There, hidden in the thick strokes of yellow paint, was a tiny symbol. It was the same symbol from the key tag, a circle with a vertical line through it. A closed eye. "It's a signature," Robert whispered. He realized the Alchemist wasn't just copying paintings. He was proud of his work. He was leaving a mark that only another artist could find. Robert moved his light across the table and found a small notebook. The pages were filled with names of cities: London, Rome, Berlin, Madrid. Next to each city was a date. The date for Paris was tomorrow. Suddenly, Robert heard a sound behind him. A soft, sliding sound, like a window being opened. He turned quickly, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The window at the back of the room was open, and the white curtains were blowing in the wind. On the windowsill sat a single white silk glove. It wasn't a left-hand glove like the one he found in the gallery. This was a right-hand glove. And on the palm of the glove, someone had painted a single, violet eye. Robert ran to the window and looked down into the alley. He saw a dark figure moving quickly through the shadows. The person was tall and moved with a slight limp. The same limp he had seen in the Grand Gallery. "He's here," Robert said into his radio. "The Alchemist is in Paris." The next morning, the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. Robert and Agent Vance stood in the shadow of the glass pyramid of the Louvre. The museum was not yet open to the public, and the great courtyard was empty and silent. The date in the notebook was today. Vance said. She was wearing an earpiece and looking at her watch. "Our teams are stationed at every major exit. If anyone tries to move a large package, we will know." "They won't move a large package," Robert said. He was looking at the museum's massive walls. "They already moved the fake in. Today is the day they take the real one out. The switch happens in the dark, during the shift change of the guards." They entered the museum through a side door used by the staff. The Louvre was a different place without the thousands of tourists. The long hallways felt like tunnels in a mountain. The statues of white marble looked like silent giants watching them pass. Robert led Vance toward the Denon wing, where the most famous Italian paintings were kept. He didn't go to the main hall. He went to the restoration basement, the heart of the museum's hospital for art. Inside the basement, the air was perfectly controlled. It was cool and dry. Long rows of paintings sat on metal racks, waiting for cleaning or repair. Robert walked past a 15th century landscape and stopped in front of a large, wooden crate. The crate was marked with a red stamp, Urgent Repair, Gallery 711. Gallery 711 is where the Mona Lisa hangs. Vance whispered. Robert took a crowbar from a nearby tool rack. He didn't ask for permission. He jammed the metal into the wood and pulled. The nails screamed as they came out. The lid of the crate fell to the floor with a loud bang. Inside the crate was a painting. It was the Mona Lisa, but as Robert shined his light on the face of the famous woman, he saw it. Her eyes were not brown. They were a deep, haunting violet. "It's already happened," Robert said, his voice trembling. "The switch is done. This is the fake they are taking out because they realized the eyes were wrong. They made a mistake, and they were trying to fix it." "Then the one hanging in the gallery right now," Vance started, "is the perfect lie." Robert finished. Suddenly, the lights in the basement flickered. A loud, electronic hum filled the room, followed by the sound of heavy metal doors locking. The security system had been triggered. "Vance, your radio," Robert shouted. Vance pulled her radio from her belt, but it was dead. No signal. "They've jammed the building again." From the shadows at the end of the rack of paintings, a man stepped out. He was wearing a white lab coat and a mask. In his hand, he held a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. "Mr. Miller," the man said. His voice was muffled by the mask, but it was calm. "You are very good at finding mistakes. But in art, as in life, some mistakes are meant to be permanent." The man dropped the vial. It shattered on the floor, and a thick, white gas began to fill the room. The white gas swirled around Robert's boots like a hungry ghost. It was thick, cold, and smelled faintly of almonds, a scent every restorer knew to fear. It was cyanide-based, a deadly chemical often used in old, dangerous fumigation processes for wooden altars. But in this concentration, it was a death sentence. "Don't breathe," Robert shouted, his voice muffled as he pulled his heavy wool scarf over his nose and mouth. Agent Vance was already coughing. She reached for her sidearm, but her movements were slow and clumsy. The gas was attacking her nervous system. Robert scanned the room. The alchemist had vanished into the maze of paintings, the sound of his footsteps mocking them from the shadows. Robert knew they couldn't stay on the floor. The gas was heavier than air. He grabbed Vance's arm and pulled her toward a tall metal ladder used for reaching the high storage racks. "Up. We have to go up." They climbed desperately. As they reached the top platform, 5 meters above the ground, the air became clearer. Vance slumped against the metal railing, gasping for breath. Robert looked down. The basement was now a lake of white mist. Below them, the shattered vial continued to hiss. Robert's eyes darted around the ceiling. He saw the massive ventilation ducts. In a museum like the Louvre, the air filtration system was a masterpiece of engineering. If he could trigger the emergency purge, the gas would be sucked out in seconds. He looked at the wall and saw a red lever behind a glass casing. It was 10 meters away, across a gap between the racks. "Vance, give me your gun," Robert commanded. She handed it to him with shaking hands. Robert took a deep breath, aimed at the glass casing, and fired. The glass shattered. He fired again, hitting the red metal lever. With a heavy lever dropped, a deep roar filled the room as the powerful fans surged to life. The white mist began to spin, drawn upward into the vents like a disappearing spirit. Within a minute, the floor was visible again. But the room was empty. The alchemist was gone, and the crate containing the violet-eyed Mona Lisa was open, and empty. He took it. Vance whispered, standing up unsteadily. He took the fake and the real one is still out there. Why would he want both? Because you can't prove a painting is a fake if the original no longer exists to compare it to. Robert realized. He's going to destroy the real one. The power in the Louvre remained out, but the emergency lights began to flicker with a ghostly blue glow. Robert and Vance ran from the basement, their footsteps echoing through the hollow stone corridors. He's heading for the underground exits near the carousel. Vance said, her radio finally crackling back to life. All units. Suspect is moving toward the shopping mall level. He is armed with chemical agents and is carrying a high-value asset. They reached the Great Gallery. The long hall, usually filled with thousands of people, was a dark tunnel of silent masterpieces. The light from Robert's heavy flashlight danced across the faces in the paintings. Kings, queens, and saints watching them with painted eyes. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the far end of the hall. It was the Alchemist. He wasn't running. He was walking with a strange, calm confidence. In his left hand, he carried a long, flat wooden case. "Stop!" Vance screamed, leveling her weapon. The Alchemist turned. In the blue light, his mask looked like a skull. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into his white lab coat and pulled out a small, high-powered laser. He pointed it at a 17th-century masterpiece hanging on the wall. "One more step, Agent, and I burn a hole through the heart of the French Renaissance," the Alchemist said. His voice was no longer muffled. It was clear, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar to Robert. Robert froze. He recognized that tone. He recognized the way the man stood. "Thomas." Robert whispered. "Thomas Kane." The man in the mask stiffened. Slowly, he reached up and removed the mask. Underneath was a face Robert hadn't seen in 15 years. His former mentor, the man who had taught him everything about the chemistry of paint before vanishing in a fire in Florence. "Hello, Robert," Kane said, a sad smile touching his lips. "I see you still have an eye for the details. But you're on the wrong side of history. The Syndicate isn't destroying art. We're liberating it from the eyes of people who don't deserve to see it." "You're a thief, Thomas," Robert said, his heart breaking. "You're a forger." "I am the greatest artist who ever lived," Kane replied. "Because I can paint so well that the world accepts my soul as the truth. Now, stay back. I have a flight to catch." Kane triggered a small flashbang device at his feet. A blinding white light filled the hall. By the time Robert's eyes adjusted, the Great Gallery was empty. The flashbang left a ringing in Robert's ears and a bitter taste in his mouth. He stumbled forward, coughing, as the smoke cleared. Thomas Kane was gone. Vance was on her radio, screaming for the exits to be sealed. But Robert knew it was useless. Kane knew the Louvre's hidden geography better than the architects. Robert walked to the spot where Kane had stood. On the floor, resting exactly where the flashbang had exploded, was a small, square piece of vellum. Robert knelt and picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a sketch, a perfect, hand-drawn map of the London Underground. Specifically, the Northern Line. One station was circled in a dark, violet ink. Charing Cross. "He's leading us," Robert said, showing the map to Vance. "Or it's a trap," she replied, wiping soot from her forehead. "Robert, we need to regroup. You almost died in that basement. Kane is dangerous. He's not just a forger, he's a chemist who knows how to turn a museum into a gas chamber." "He won't kill me," Robert said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "He left this for me. He wants me to see the masterpiece. He thinks I'm the only one worthy of his final act." They exited the Louvre into the cold Parisian night. Blue police lights reflected off the glass pyramid. The museum was surrounded, but Kane had vanished into the network of old Roman saws beneath the city. Vance's phone rang. She listened for a moment, her face turning grim. Our contact in London just reported a security breach at the National Gallery. Someone bypassed the laser grid in the Sainsbury wing. They didn't take anything. They left something. A violet-eyed painting. Robert guessed. A note. Vance said. Addressed to you. It was pinned to the frame of Van Gogh's sunflowers. Robert looked at the iron key still in his pocket. The syndicate was moving faster than the law could follow. They weren't just switching paintings anymore. They were taunting the world, proving that they controlled the visual history of the human race. Get the plane ready. Robert said. We're going to London. London greeted them with a thick, grey fog that swallowed the tops of the buildings. The air was damp and smelled of coal smoke and river water. Robert and Vance were met at Heathrow by a team from Scotland Yard's Art and Antiquities Unit. As they drove through the winding streets toward Trafalgar Square, Robert stared at the map Kane had left him. Charing Cross was more than just a tube station. It was the gateway to the National Gallery. Why London? Robert. Vance asked. The Louvre is the crown jewel. Why move the game here? The National Gallery holds the Wilton diptych and the Arnolfini portrait. Robert explained. These aren't just paintings. They are the foundations of Western perspective. If Kane replaces them, he isn't just stealing art, he's changing the way we see the past. He wants to prove that truth is whatever he paints it to be. They arrived at the National Gallery. The massive lions of Trafalgar Square looked like shadows in the fog. Inside, the gallery was under total lockdown. Armed officers stood in every doorway. Robert was led to the Sainsbury wing. There, standing on a tripod in the middle of the room, was the note. It was written on 18th century paper, the ink still smelling of oak gall. Robert. The chair in Paris was a test. The eyes in the Louvre were a greeting. Meet me where the river meets the rail at midnight. Bring no one but your eyes. If I see a badge, the sunflowers burn. Robert looked at the Van Gogh painting on the wall. It was one of the most famous images in the world. He stepped closer, his magnifying glass ready. He didn't even need to look for the symbol. He could see it in the brushstrokes. The yellow paint was too thick. The texture was slightly too smooth. This isn't the real sunflowers. Robert whispered, his voice cracking. He's already been here. He did the switch while we were still in the air over the channel. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The syndicate wasn't just a group of thieves. They were a shadow government of art. And they were winning. The room in the Sainsbury wing felt colder than the London fog outside. Robert stood before the sunflowers, his breath hitching. To the guards, to the curators, even to the advanced infrared scanners of the National Gallery. This was the masterpiece painted by Vincent van Gogh in 1888. But Robert didn't need a machine. He had his eyes, and his eyes told him a terrifying truth. The painting was screaming in a voice only he could hear. Look at the chrome yellow. Robert whispered, pointing a gloved finger near the center of the largest bloom. Van Gogh used a specific lead chromate. Over a century, it oxidizes. It loses its shout and becomes a duller, brown-leaning ochre. This yellow is vibrant. It's too alive. Agent Vance stepped closer, her face etched with disbelief. But the carbon dating on the canvas came back positive for the late 19th century. The frame is original. How could he do this? Thomas didn't just paint over a new canvas. Robert explained, his mind racing through the lessons he had learned 15 years ago. He found an unimportant painting from the same era, a portrait of a merchant or a landscape by a nobody. He stripped the lead white primer off, layer by layer, until he reached the original threads. Then, He reconstructed the masterpiece using pigments he aged in a centrifuge to simulate 100 years of light exposure. Robert pulled out a small vial of a specialized solvent from his kit. He applied a microscopic drop to the edge of a petal. In a real Van Gogh, the oil would be brittle, resisting the liquid. Here, the paint softened just a fraction of a millimeter. It's a chemical miracle, Robert said. He's using a polymer binder that mimics the molecular structure of dried linseed oil, but it hasn't fully vitrified. It looks 130 years old, but it's actually less than 6 months old. The gravity of the situation sank in. If Kane could replicate the chemical signature of time itself, no museum in the world was safe. Every history book, every cultural touchstone, could be replaced by a high-tech ghost. The syndicate wasn't just stealing art. They were colonizing the human memory. Vance checked her watch. It was 11:15 p.m. We have 45 minutes. Charing Cross is only a 5-minute walk. You're really going alone? He told me to bring my eyes, Robert said, packing his kit. If the police move in, he'll destroy the original. I can't let that yellow die. Sarah, I'm the only one who knows exactly what we're losing. The fog over the River Thames was so thick it felt like walking through wet wool. Robert walked toward Charing Cross, the iron key cold against his palm. The streetlights were mere orange smudges in the grey haze. To his left, the Hungerford Bridge loomed like the skeleton of a great beast, the rails humming with the distant vibration of a late-night train. This was the place where the river meets the rail. Robert stood at the edge of the embankment, the dark water of the Thames lapping rhythmically against the stone walls. The sound was lonely, an ancient heartbeat beneath the modern city. You're late, Robert. A voice drifted from the shadows beneath the bridge. Robert turned. Thomas Kane emerged from the fog. He wasn't wearing his lab coat or a mask now. He wore an elegant black overcoat and carried a cane with a silver handle shaped like a raven's head. He looked like a gentleman out for a midnight stroll, not the world's most dangerous forger. I had to confirm your work at the gallery, Robert said, his voice steady. The sunflowers. It's a tragedy. Thomas, you've turned a masterpiece into a mirror of your own ego. Kane laughed, the sound echoing off the damp stone. Ego? No, Robert. It's justice. Why should these works belong to the state? To be stared at by tourists who only care if the gift shop has a postcard. I give these paintings a second life. I take the originals to places where they are truly worshipped, and I leave the world a perfect dream in their place. Does the public suffer if the dream is indistinguishable from the reality? The truth matters, Robert countered. The soul of the art comes from the hand of the man who suffered to make it. You're just a photocopy with a heartbeat. Kane stepped closer, the silver raven on his cane glinting. Is that so? Then tell me, Robert, if I gave you 2 canvases right now, one painted by Vincent in a fit of madness and one painted by me in a moment of cold perfection, and you couldn't tell them apart, does the soul still exist? Or is the soul just a story we tell ourselves to justify the price tag? Kane gestured toward a small wooden door built into the base of the bridge's support pillar. The original sunflowers is inside, along with something much older. Come. I want to show you the alchemy of gold before the syndicate moves the collection to the east. Beyond the wooden door lay a spiral staircase that descended deep below the level of the river. The air here was salt-tinged and vibrated with the roar of the underground trains passing nearby. Kane led Robert into a vaulted chamber that looked like an alchemist's den from the Middle Ages, crossed with a 21st century laboratory. On a central table, illuminated by high CRI LEDs, lay a painting that made Robert's knees go weak. It was the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck. The detail was staggering: the convex mirror, the tiny dog, the intricate folds of the green dress. I haven't replaced this one yet, Kane whispered, his voice full of genuine reverence. "The oil glazing technique of the Flemish masters. It's the highest peak of human achievement. Layer upon layer of translucent color. It doesn't reflect light, it traps it." "Why show me this?" Robert asked, his eyes fixed on the painting. "Because I want you to join me," Kane said, turning to him. "The Syndicate is building a new library of Alexandria, a private sanctuary for the world's true treasures, safe from war, from climate change, and from the prying eyes of the unwashed masses. I need a second eye. Someone who can verify the restorations. Someone who loves the paint as much as I do." Kane walked to a large safe in the corner and pulled out a small, heavy bar of what looked like solid gold. He handed it to Robert. It was incredibly heavy, but the texture was off. "It's lead," Robert realized. "Gold-plated lead." Kane corrected. "That is what the world is becoming, Robert. A leaden reality with a thin, golden skin. I am the only one providing the gold. If you stay with Interpol, you are just a janitor for a dying museum. With me, you are a priest of the eternal." Robert looked at the Arnolfini portrait, then at the lead bar. He felt the temptation, the desire to live among the greatest works ever created, away from the politics and the filth of the world. But then he remembered Clara's face in the Grand Gallery. He remembered the look of wonder on a child's face seeing a masterpiece for the first time. "You aren't a priest, Thomas," Robert said, dropping the lead bar. It hit the stone floor with a dull, hollow sound. "You're a jailer. You want to hide the sun so you can sell the world a candle." Kane's expression hardened. "A pity. I truly hoped you had grown beyond your sentimentality." He pulled a small remote from his pocket. "The police are 5 minutes away. Sarah Vance is very predictable. But they won't find the Arnolfini. And they won't find you." A hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a dark tunnel that smelled of ozone and electricity. "This leads to the abandoned deep-level shelters of the Northern Line," Kane said. "A world beneath the world." Before Robert could react, Kane stepped into the tunnel. Robert followed, driven by the need to secure the Arnolfini. But as he stepped through, the panel slid shut with the force of a guillotine. He was trapped in the dark. Robert turned on his heavy-duty flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow, circular tunnel lined with rusted iron plates. This was a ghost station, a part of the London Underground forgotten since World War II. The sound of a train began to build, a low, thrumming growl that vibrated in Robert's teeth. He realized he wasn't alone. Far down the tunnel, Kane's silhouette was moving toward a maintenance platform that overlooked the active tracks. Robert ran, his boots clattering on the iron floor. He reached the platform just as a high-speed train roared past, a blur of silver and light. The wind from the train almost knocked him over. Kane was standing at the edge, holding the long black bag containing the Arnolfini portrait. He looked at Robert, his eyes reflecting the passing lights. "The Syndicate has a train of its own, Robert. A ghost car that runs between the scheduled service. It's how we move the inventory." A single, unlit train car began to slow down as it approached the platform. It had no windows and was painted a matte black. "Last chance," Kane shouted over the screech of the brakes. "The truth or the lie?" Robert didn't answer with words. He lunged forward, grabbing the strap of the black bag. They struggled on the edge of the platform as the black train car came to a halt. Kane was surprisingly strong, fueled by a fanatic's energy. "Let go!" Kane roared, swinging his cane. The silver raven caught Robert in the ribs, sending a flare of agony through his chest. Robert fell back, but he didn't let go of the strap. The bag tore. The Arnolfini portrait slid out, its ancient wood panel clattering toward the gap between the platform and the train. "No!" Both men screamed at once. The masterpiece, the foundation of Western perspective, was inches away from being crushed by the multi-ton weight of the train. Robert reached out, his fingers straining, the heat from the train's undercarriage burning his skin. He caught the edge of the frame. But as he did, Kane's foot slipped on the damp iron. The forger fell forward, his hands reaching for the same frame. For a split second, they were both holding the treasure, suspended over the abyss. The screech of metal on metal was a physical pain in Robert's ears. The black train car remained stationary, but the air around it was alive with the violent heat of the third rail. Robert's fingers were white, his knuckles straining as he gripped the oak edge of the Arnolfini portrait. Above him, Thomas Kane's face was a mask of pure desperation. "Let go, Robert!" Kane roared, his voice cracking. "If it falls, it's lost to both of us. Give it to me, and I'll pull you up." Robert looked down into the gap. The darkness between the platform and the train felt like a mouth waiting to swallow the 15th century treasure. He knew Kane was lying. The moment the forger had the painting, Robert would be pushed into the path of the next scheduled train. With a surge of adrenaline, Robert didn't pull the painting toward himself. He shoved it sideways, sliding it onto the flat metal floor of the maintenance platform, safely away from the edge. The sudden shift in weight caught Kane off balance. The forger's hands slipped from the frame, and he tumbled backward into the black car of the ghost train. The doors of the black car hissed shut instantly. "Thomas!" Robert scrambled up, reaching for the door, but there was no handle. Inside the windowless car, Kane pounded on the metal. "You've saved a ghost, Robert. But the Syndicate has the world. You can't stop the sunrise." The train surged forward with a violent jolt. It didn't move like a normal underground train. It was silent, propelled by a magnetic hum that vibrated through the very floor of the tunnel. Within seconds, the red taillights vanished into the curve of the northern line, leaving Robert alone in the echoing silence of the ghost station. Robert slumped against the rusted iron wall, his chest heaving. He crawled toward the Arnolfini portrait. The painting lay face down on the gritty floor. With trembling hands, he turned it over. The green dress of the woman, the intricate mirror, they were safe. But as his flashlight passed over the back of the panel, he saw a thin, jagged crack in the original wood. From within that crack, something glinted. Not gold, and not lead. It was a tiny, translucent sliver of glass, a data drive, hidden behind the centuries-old oak. By the time Agent Vance and the Scotland Yard team reached the maintenance platform, Robert was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his flashlight fixed on the glass sliver. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the Arnolfini as if it were a person he had just saved from a fire. "Robert!" Vance's voice echoed through the tunnel. She ran to him, her gun finally holstered. "We lost the signal on the ghost car. It disappeared near Euston. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Robert said, his voice a dry whisper. He held up the glass sliver. "But Thomas isn't just a forger. He's a librarian. He wasn't just hiding documents in the sunlight frame. He was hiding the digital maps to every switch the Syndicate has ever made." Vance took the sliver with a pair of tweezers. "This is high-level encryption. If this is what I think it is, it's the manifest, the locations of all the originals." Robert stood up, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. He looked at the Arnolfini. "The crack in the wood. I can fix it. But I can't fix the fact that we're looking at a world of replicas. Sarah, how many of these are out there? Based on the Syndicate's activity." Vance said, looking at the painting. "We estimate over 500 masterpieces in 30 countries. It's the largest art heist in human history, happening in plain sight." They moved back to the surface, the cold London air feeling like a blessing after the ozone of the tunnels. In the back of the Interpol van, Vance plugged the glass sliver into a portable decryptor. The screen flickered with thousands of lines of code before resolving into a 3D map of the world. Hundreds of red dots pulsed across Europe, North America, and Asia. But in the center of Europe, tucked deep within the Swiss Alps, was a single, large gold star. The Fortress of Art. Robert said. The new library of Alexandria Kane talked about. It's a decommissioned military bunker. Vance noted, her eyes scanning the coordinates. Built into the Eiger Mountain. Private ownership, registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It's a free port, a place where the law can't touch what's inside because it technically doesn't exist on any tax map. That's where they're keeping them. Robert realized. The real ones. Thomas is heading there now. The flight to Zurich was a blur of high-altitude clouds and hushed conversations. Robert spent the time studying the blueprints of the Eiger bunker that Vance had managed to pull from old Cold War archives. The facility was a marvel of paranoid architecture. It was carved 300 meters into solid granite, designed to survive a nuclear strike. It had its own power, its own air filtration, and, most importantly for the syndicate, its own climate-controlled vaults. We can't just knock on the door, Vance said, pointing to the primary entrance, a 10-ton steel door at the end of a private railway tunnel. The Swiss authorities are slow to move on free ports. We have no jurisdiction unless we can prove a crime is occurring inside the mountain at this very second. The sliver is the proof, Robert said. But they'll have shifted their security the moment Kane got on that train. He knows I have it. Robert looked at the chemical analysis of the Sunflowers copy they had found in London. There's a signature in the paint. Sarah. Every artist has a hand. Even when Thomas is being perfect, he uses a specific ratio of cobalt in his drying agents. It's like a DNA sequence. He pulled out a portable spectrometer. If I can get close enough to the ventilation exhausts of that mountain, I can detect the off-gassing of his fresh masterpieces. I can prove that the bunker is a factory for forgeries. And once we have that, Vance asked, then we don't just go in to arrest them. Robert said, his eyes turning cold. We go in to take back the history of the world. Every red dot on that map represents a piece of the human soul that they've locked in a cage. As the plane began its descent over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Alps, Robert felt a shift in himself. He wasn't just a restorer or a detective anymore. He was a witness. He was going to the one place where the truth was still hidden, and he was going to bring it back into the light. The small town of Grindald sat at the base of the Eiger, a postcard-perfect village of wooden chalets and flickering lights. But above it, the mountain loomed like a silent, dark god. Robert and Vance stood on the balcony of a private safe house. The air was so cold it stung their lungs. Through high-powered binoculars, Robert could see the faint glow of security lights near the hidden railway entrance. The syndicate uses the Jungfrau railway line, Vance explained. They have a private spur that breaks off deep inside the mountain. That's how they move the crates without anyone in the village seeing. Tonight is the night of the Grand Exchange, Robert said, checking his watch. The sliver's data showed a massive shipment of fakes leaving for the Asian markets at 3 a.m. They'll be swapping out 3 galleries in Tokyo and 2 in Shanghai in a single sweep. Robert packed his kit one last time. He didn't take a gun. He took a set of high-precision chemical sensors and a bottle of a very specific solvent, one that could dissolve Kane's Alchemist polymer in seconds without hurting the 500-year-old paint beneath. If we fail, Sarah, Robert said, looking at her, the world will wake up tomorrow, and the history books will still be the same, but the real will be gone forever. It'll just be a planet of copies. We won't fail, Vance said, handing him a cold-weather tactical suit. Because you can see what they can't. You see the lie. They climbed into a waiting helicopter, its rotors silent and black. As they lifted off, heading toward the vertical face of the Aga, Robert looked back at the village. The people down there were sleeping, trusting that the world they saw yesterday would be the same one they saw tomorrow. He intended to make sure they were right. The helicopter banked sharply against the vertical granite face of the Aga. Below them, the swirling snow looked like white smoke against the black rock. Robert felt the vibration of the rotors in his teeth, a rhythmic thrum that matched the pounding of his heart. They were landing on a narrow, ice-slicked ledge 300 meters above the valley floor. The ventilation shaft is 50 meters to the east. Agent Vance shouted over the wind. She was already out of the cockpit, her tactical gear blending into the shadows. Once we drop in, the signal will go dark. We have exactly 60 minutes before the Swiss tactical team arrives at the front gate. We have to be the ones to confirm the cargo. Robert stepped out, his boots crunching on the permafrost. In his hand, he gripped the Raman spectrometer like a weapon. They moved toward a massive metal grate, encrusted with ice. Robert knelt and placed the sensor against the steel. The screen flickered, analyzing the air molecules being pushed out from the mountain's heart. "He's in there," Robert whispered. "And he's working. The air is thick with the smell of a century being born in a day." They used a silent hydraulic spreader to pop the grate. One by one, they slid into the darkness. The air inside was warmer, smelling of ozone and expensive filtration. They were in the lungs of the mountain. Robert led the way through a series of narrow service tunnels, following the map from the data sliver. They reached a heavy observation window overlooking the main transport hub. Below them, a private electric train was being loaded. Dozens of men in grey jumpsuits moved with military precision. They were carrying crates that Robert recognized, the same reinforced wooden boxes used by the world's most prestigious museums. "Look at the labels," Vance whispered, pointing her binoculars. "The Uffizi, the Prado, the Met. They're moving the entire history of the Renaissance tonight." "It's not just a theft," Robert said, his eyes scanning the crates. "It's a migration. They're replacing the public record with a private one." They bypassed the security cameras using a loop program Vance had prepared. They descended a spiral staircase into the primary storage level. Here, the tunnels opened into a vast, cathedral-like space. The walls were lined with thousands of sliding metal racks. Robert walked to the nearest rack and pulled it out. His breath caught in his throat. It was the Night Watch by Rembrandt. Or rather, it was the real one. He could tell by the way the impasto caught the light. The shadows weren't just black paint. They were depths of history that no forger could replicate, even Thomas. "Sarah, look," Robert called out. He moved from rack to rack. It was a hall of ghosts. The lost masterpieces of the last century were all here, glowing in the soft, museum-grade LED lights. They weren't in a dark basement. They were in a perfect, silent temple. The syndicate isn't just selling them, Vance realized, walking among the paintings. They are holding them. They've built a shadow museum for the 0.01%. A place where the elite can come to see the real world while the rest of us live in the copy. Robert stopped in front of a small, empty easel in the center of the room. A small brass plaque sat on the table next to it. It read, "Reserved for the sunlight. Clara's painting." Robert said. This was meant to be the centerpiece. Thomas wasn't just stealing it for the land. He wanted it because it was a perfect lie that fit his collection. Suddenly, the lights in the vault dimmed. A voice came over the intercom, smooth and cold. "Welcome, Robert. I knew you couldn't resist the call of the original. Please, move to the center of the hall. The grand exchange is about to begin, and I would hate for you to miss the final brushstroke." They moved toward the far end of the vault, where a set of double glass doors slid open automatically. Inside was a room that made Robert's studio look like a child's playroom. It was a state-of-the-art forgery lab, filled with centrifuges, particle accelerators, and rows of vintage canvases. Thomas Kane stood at the far end of the room, standing before a massive canvas. He wasn't wearing his black overcoat anymore. He was back in his white lab coat, a brush in his hand. He looked like a man possessed. "Do you know the chemical formula for the glow of the 17th century, Robert?" Kane asked without turning around. "It's not just oil and lead. It's the lead carbonate reacting with the trace impurities of the time. I've spent 20 years perfecting the reaction." Kane turned, his eyes bright with a feverish light. "I am currently finishing the replacement for the Mona Lisa. The one you found in Paris was a prototype. This is the soul of Leonardo, reborn in my hands." "You're a murderer, Thomas," Robert said, stepping forward. "You're killing the connection between the artist and the audience. You're making the world stop believing in what they see. The world wants to be lied to." Kane countered. "They want the bright, the new, the perfect. I give them that. And in exchange, I save the old from their clumsy hands. Look around you. Here, the art is safe. No vandals, no humidity, no wars. Just the pure, unadulterated past." Vance raised her weapon. "It's over, Kane. The Swiss authorities are 10 minutes away. The grand exchange is cancelled." Kane smiled, a slow, terrifying expression. "Is it? The train is already leaving the lower levels. The fakes are already on their way to the ports. And as for this vault, if I can't have the truth, no one will." He pressed a button on a small remote. A series of red lights began to pulse on the walls. Robert heard the hiss of gas, not poison this time, but something far more calculated. Acetone vapor. Robert whispered, his eyes widening. "He's going to melt them." The air in the vault began to shimmer. Acetone, a powerful solvent, was being pumped into the room in a fine mist. At this concentration, it wouldn't kill a human immediately, but it would begin to soften the top layers of oil paint on every masterpiece in the room. The Shadow Museum was about to become a hall of running colors. "Thomas, stop!" Robert screamed. "You're destroying the very things you claim to love. If they aren't mine, they are nothing." Kane roared. Robert didn't look at Kane. He looked at the Arnolfini portrait, which was sitting on a nearby rack. The delicate glazes were already starting to lose their shine. He reached into his kit and pulled out a small spray bottle. It contained a neutralizing polymer he had developed for his own restoration work, a substance that could create a temporary, airtight seal over a canvas. "Vance, keep him busy," Robert shouted. Robert ran to the Arnolfini. He began to spray the neutralizing mist, his hands moving with the speed of a man fighting a fire. He moved to the Rembrandt, then the Van Gogh. He was a dervish of restoration, trying to save centuries of human history in seconds. Kane watched him, a look of pure hatred on his face. He lunged at Robert, swinging his heavy silver cane. Vance fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "Drop the cane. Kane!" She yelled. Kane ignored her. He was focused entirely on Robert. He saw Robert saving the paintings he had spent his life trying to control. To Kane, Robert was the ultimate rival, the only man who could undo his alchemy. They collided near the central easel. The cane shattered the glass table, sending shards flying. Robert grabbed Kane's arm, the two men grappling on the floor. "You can't save them all, Robert," Kane hissed. "The system is automated. The whole mountain is a pyre. I don't have to save them all." Robert gasped, pinned beneath the stronger man. "I just have to save the truth." Robert felt Kane's fingers around his throat, but his own hand was searching the floor. He found the small bottle of his neutralizing agent. Instead of spraying the paintings, he turned the nozzle toward the overhead ventilation sensor. If he could coat the sensor in the thick polymer, the system would think the air was clear and shut off the acetone flow. He took a gamble, aiming the spray upward. The thick, white liquid hit the sensor dead center. The hissing sound stopped. The red lights changed to a steady green. The great purge had been halted. Kane froze, his hands still on Robert's neck. He looked up at the sensor, then back at Robert. The silence in the room was absolute. The forger's face went from rage to a hollow, broken emptiness. You chose the paintings over the capture." Kane whispered. "I always choose the art, Thomas," Robert said, pushing him off. Vance moved in quickly, pinning Kane to the floor and snapping the handcuffs onto his wrists. The alchemist didn't fight back. He looked at the Arnolfini portrait, now covered in a protective white film, and began to weep. It wasn't the cry of a repentant man. It was the cry of an artist who realized his audience had finally seen through the trick. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The Swiss tactical team had arrived. The front gate was breached. The syndicate of shadows was falling. The aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Hundreds of police officers and art experts flooded the bunker. Robert sat on a wooden crate, a thermal blanket over his shoulders, watching as the masterpieces were carefully prepared for their long journey back to their rightful homes. Vance walked over to him, her face smudged with soot but glowing with victory. The ghost train was intercepted at the border. "Every fake has been seized. We have the manifest. Robert, we can prove every switch." "And the originals?" Robert asked. "They're safe," she said, looking at the hall of paintings. "Thanks to you. The experts say your neutralizing spray saved the glazes. A few weeks of careful cleaning, and no one will ever know they were nearly dissolved." Robert looked at Kane, who was being led away by two guards. The forger stopped for a second and looked at Robert. He didn't say anything, but he nodded once, a final, silent acknowledgement between two men who spent their lives in the service of the same masters, even if they served them differently. "What happens to the bunker?" Robert asked. "It's being turned into a high-security international repository," Vance said. "A real one this time. Operated by the UN. No more private shadow museums." Robert stood up, his body aching. He looked at the sunlight easel, still empty. He knew where that painting belonged. It wasn't in a mountain, and it wasn't in a billionaire's house. It belonged in the light. 2 months later, the Grand Gallery was once again filled with people. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There were no black ties or expensive perfumes. The doors were open to everyone. In the center of the room, in the heavy golden frame, sat the real sunlight. After the documents were found and the lie was revealed, the public's interest had tripled. They didn't come to see a perfect masterpiece. They came to see a painting that had survived a fire, a theft, and a global conspiracy. Clara stood next to Robert, her hand on his arm. "You did it, Robert. You brought the truth back. The truth was always there, Clara," Robert said. "It just needed someone to stop trying to paint over it." The gallery now featured a special exhibit on the Syndicate of Shadows. Next to the masterpieces were the forgeries that Kane had created. People spent hours looking at both, trying to see the difference. They learned about the chemistry, the history, and the soul that Robert had talked about. Robert looked at the sunlight. He had spent the last month personally restoring the frame and cleaning the canvas. He knew every inch of it. He knew the cracks, the errors, and the places where the artist's hand had slipped. And to him, those were the most beautiful parts. Robert walked home through the city, the sun setting behind the skyline. He reached his small studio and opened the door. The smell of turpentine and old wood greeted him like an old friend. He sat at his workbench. There was a new painting on the easel, a simple portrait of a woman from a local family, her eyes full of life and a bit of sadness. It wasn't a masterpiece, and it wasn't worth millions, but it was real. He picked up his brush and a small tray of pigments. He didn't think about the Alchemist or the Syndicate. He thought about the light hitting the canvas. The world would always have shadows. There would always be people who wanted to steal the truth or replace it with a more convenient lie. But as long as there were people who cared enough to look closely, to see the blue fiber in the gold, the violet eye in the dark, and the soul beneath the paint, the light would always find its way back. Robert Miller dipped his brush into the oil and began to work. He wasn't fixing the past anymore. He was painting the future.